Welcome to the podcast from Infotagion, the independent fact-checking service to combat fake news about the coronavirus. This is the first major public health crisis in the age of social media disinformation, and we're here to try and make sense of it. I'm Damian Collins MP, co-founder of Infotagion and former chair of the House of Commons Select Committee for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And today we are joined by our special guest, Baroness Martha Lane Fox. Martha came to public attention when her company lastminute.com became one of the highest profile British successes of the dot-com boom in the early 2000s. She's now the founding chair of .everyone, a think tank championing ethical tech, as well as sitting on the board of Twitter and the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy in the House of Lords. We'll also be hearing, as always, from our resident experts, the disinformation analyst Dr. Charles Creel and John Quinlan, the CEO of Iconic Labs. Martha Lane Fox, if I could come to you first. I think there's a very interesting issue at the moment as we look at coronavirus, and Infotagion's very much focused on disinformation, but there's this other big issue, I think, which is part of the tech debate about the use of personal data. We've been talking recently about track and trace tools, and the suspicion I think a lot of people have as to whether their data is safe in that context. And I wonder if this you think is a sort of bit of a dilemma for the tech sector, in that the growing mistrust around the way in which things like data is gathered and used in some ways is making people cautious about how that's used in a health and medical context, which could be in some ways very helpful with confronting something like coronavirus, but in some ways the levels of public trust needed to allow a big buy-in for that sort of technology at the moment is lacking. And I wondered, given your sort of great experience working in the sector and the work you do in promoting ethical tech through .everyone, whether this is something you've been looking at.
Well, this is a rapidly changing landscape, and one of the things .everyone has been doing over the last couple of years is tracking people's general attitudes to tech as a kind of way of seeing whether or not both we as an organisation are making any progress, but us as the UK, we've really, as you know, tried to set this country up as a place where we have slightly different standards that we want to apply to the tech landscape. And I think what's really interesting about this contact tracing particularly, and all the talk of the app around it and its usage, is that it gets, as you say, to the heart of so many issues. Do people trust government? Do people trust corporations? What is that transaction around data? Do they understand it? When we've looked at this, we've found so often that people can see the use in technology, their daily use of all the things that we all know well, but they have a real unease about how it's affecting society more broadly, or a real mistrust of the large corporations that don't pay their tax, or, to be honest, governments that are often patchy in their own use of tech. So I think it gets to the heart of so many things that the sector is trying to unpick. I personally think that we describe this in slightly lazy terms. Data is a very confusing word. It can mean, an individual transaction on the site, both kind of commercial or non-commercial. It can mean the kind of anonymized bulk data collection that often we are actually talking about in health tracking apps, or it can mean, a piece of data that's passed between you and another person in a private conversation. I think it's very important that we're specific to give people confidence and trust. Very important that we tell them exactly what this data is going to be used for, how long it's going to be stored for, where it's going to be, how it's going to be deleted, and so on. And I think that's why this is complex, because, as you say, it really does get to the nub of so many things people are worrying and thinking about in the sector.
Do you think we might look back on this period as the moment when that sort of data privacy, data security, giving people the right to grant permission for their data to be used more readily, that this will be the moment that this debate really, really took off, and that the era of companies gathering data in some way slightly covertly without people really knowing what they're doing, that world will start to come to an end?
I think I really do veer between kind of feeling quite optimistic, not obviously specifically now about the hideous challenges people are facing, but kind of on the macro view, and really very dispirited. And I know it's not a very helpful answer, but it's the truth. And I feel that that's true of many people, both kind of academics in the sector, people who create policy, and people who work building products and services. I think, this, on one level, has really forced institutions. You look at our own parliament and how that's suddenly come online in the last 10 days, and it's forced companies to really think about their use of technology, and obviously inherent in that, their use of data and how they share it with whoever their constituent user groups are. So yes, in some ways, how could this not have forced those conversations? In other ways, however, I feel as though some things might just not change, because it is so vital that good policy and good legislation is made and continues to be pushed through. And who knows where that's going to sit on the priority list of governments that have a huge amount of complex things to think about over the next year. So I think it's mixed, and I don't know what kind of prompt this is going to be, but I certainly think that it has promoted and provoked more conversations among the general public, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, this debate has also come along following what seems like 2 or 3 years now of considering the whole issue of online harms, which I would put disinformation as a form of harmful content as well, alongside other harmful content that circulates through social media, and the question of what sort of responsibility should be placed on the big tech platforms to act against that content. I mean, I would certainly feel this is an issue where the government should be starting to make more progress and looking to bring in legislation on this issue and enable regulators to take a look at it. Now, I know this is an issue that you've looked at quite strongly. What do you think is the best way forward now for creating a regime which gives us some sort of oversight and indeed establishes probably more legal responsibilities on people to act against harmful content online?
I think that there's lots of things that are good in the online harms white paper that you're talking about. I think that we must make sure it actually comes to Parliament. I'm still unclear about when it's going to be passed through. I think there's lots that is still far too ambiguous and needs to be unpicked. And I think I always try and come at this from the point of view of your kind of a user who is not necessarily the most tech-savvy person in the world, not necessarily the person that knows all the intricacies that we might be thinking about on a daily basis, and just ask a few questions on their behalf. What's the redress? What's the way that you can actually retrieve your data back? What's the way that you actually can get the protections that the online harms white paper suggests you'll be able to do? And I think there's still a bunch of things that need to be worked through when you're looking at it through the lens of what actually changes for users. But that's not to say we shouldn't shy away from it and get on with the debate and move it through, because I have no doubt that there will be a more regulated world of technology over the next decade. Clearly, that's going to happen. It has to come as well from the US. We can definitely lead in the UK. We can definitely build in Europe in a different way to the US, and they do look to us for examples of good legislation. But I think we also have to be realistic about what our role is in the global landscape, particularly if you take a kind of 10, 20-year view, when obviously there's a parallel internet universe being built in China, and massive investment into all kinds of technology infrastructure around the world, and we're going to be competing for both policy lead, commercial lead, and usage leads, and that's a very different landscape to the one we're in now.
Do you think we need a sort of a regulatory system for tech in a similar way to we have a regulatory system for broadcasting and other media as well? My concern, I think, in this sector is that we've got a legacy language and indeed legacy legal framework for these sorts of issues where the internet is not really regarded as broadcasting, but some people would say, well, you can effectively broadcast through the internet to millions of people in a way which has very few limitations or obligations placed upon you.
Yes, I think that's a couple of things. I think the first thing that I've talked about, and everyone has talked about quite a lot, is I really so deeply believe we need to raise the bar in digital understanding across all regulators. That's a somewhat sweeping statement, but if you are working in any sector, water through to financial services, through to energy of any kind, then you are all faced with decisions around internet-enabled and digital technologies and making regulatory decisions. So I think separating the internet out is in one way bonkers and in one way makes total sense. But in either scenario, I think we have to raise the bar for all regulators and legislators around the world in their levels of understanding. Now, that's not a moving feast. It's not like suddenly you understand the internet. I'm meant to know a little bit about it and I'm baffled every day. But I do think we can do a better job at helping people who are making public policy, budget and legislative decisions to understand the landscape a bit more. And then the second thing is, whether you structure it with a bit of regulator around Ofcom has been suggested, or everyone suggested an Office for Responsible Technology. I agree with you. There does need to be some kind of structure, and it will change and it will morph. The landscape now is not going to be the same in 5 years, not going to be the same in 10 years. But I do think it's important to just kind of get going and see what works, and then don't be afraid to kind of course correct with it and take a slightly different view to these institutional frameworks we have to set up. Perhaps in the past, you set them in stone for 100 years. Perhaps we should be kind of a bit more realistic and say, well, let's try 100 weeks or 100 days and see how we're doing, as you would with any kind of tech product or service.
Absolutely. You're quite right. Things do move so fast, and whatever institutions are created, they may need to adapt pretty quickly as well. But I mean, do you support the principle, though, that the standards that we want to see followed should be ones that, as a society and through our parliament, that we look to establish? And I mean, one of the issues I have with the approach that Mark Zuckerberg seems to be taking at Facebook is that the job of external regulators should be just effectively to mark the homework of the tech companies and really see if they're complying with their own standards and not seek to set standards for them. And my view is that shouldn't be adequate. We shouldn't be leaving it just to the companies to decide what the rules should be.
No. I didn't mean to give that impression at all. I 100% agree with you that this notional idea that the companies can do this themselves is fundamentally completely flawed. Unregulated monopolies determining a lot about our democratic processes, our commercial landscape, and so forth and so on. And this absolutely has to shift, and I believe it will. Yeah. I'm not clear exactly what that end structure looks like, and I'm not sure it really is ever an end point. I guess I'm just trying to think about what do those institutions for 2020 look like, as opposed to building them for 1920 or 1820. Yeah, but clearly it's not working right now, and we have a situation where the power is far too few hands. And the dangerous thing about the current crisis that we're in is that the big tend to be okay, right? I mean, who's going to survive out of all of this? Well, clearly Amazon, Google, Facebook are going to be just fine, Netflix, whoever it might be, and they're going to buy smaller companies and just get stronger. They're going to buy up talent that was maybe flailing in small companies, and that's what happens. So it's even more urgent to my mind that we get some of these new structures and legislative processes in place.
Absolutely. It feels that the sort of economic shock of COVID-19 has, in some ways, it's accelerated the process of digital disruption, and we're probably seeing it with businesses failing on the high streets. Mm-hmm. But whilst Amazon continue to do very well because their model suits the lockdown quite nicely, yeah. And indeed in the media that we're seeing more and more newspapers coming out of print and some businesses closing altogether. And again, I think it makes the debate around disinformation increasingly important, not just in the context of the responsibility of the tech companies to try and disrupt disinformation, but also in a world where the traditional sources of news people may have turned to are diminishing at some pace.
Yes, I agree with you. I was also thinking, you've done such brilliant work with Infotagion, but one of the things that I feel kind of anxious about, because it's something that I've tried to think about, is people in the public sector who are dealing with, often frontline issues or policy issues. I'm not sure that we really have a plan to equip them well enough. So if you're a doctor and you're facing patients coming in with massive dis or misinformation coming to you, or if you're a nurse in a hospital and you're trying to wrestle with what the right things to do are, these are complex things. You're fighting on the front line, both the actual medical pandemic, but also the infodemic, as it's been termed, as listeners will be aware. And this is a very big shift. We've got to think in, I believe, a new way about how we help people who are effectively public servants. They could be civil servants in local government. They could be people in your department, Damian. They could be anywhere. But they have got to be much more resilient in terms of understanding the shape and pace of change, because they're going to be the people who are making often very important decisions, and we've got to make sure the information that they have is robust.
And that's absolutely right. And we've seen already in this crisis that people have lost their lives as a consequence of following advice that they saw that was disinformation. And I think that because we're looking at disinformation in the middle of a global public health crisis, it's really brought the issue to public attention much more strongly, where rather than this being about political opinions, it's about news that could directly affect your life.
But do you think, Damian, the government has thought enough about, I know that the kind of responsibility always falls back on the social media companies, and to a degree I understand that, but then if you look at how that then filters through society, do you think the government is thinking enough about how to make sure that people working through our public services and essential services are able to fight the infodemic as much as the pandemic?
Well, I think their priorities have obviously clearly been on the pandemic. I think on the infodemic side, I think for professionals and practitioners, then in the front line, then yes, I think they will be equipped. But one of the things that concerned us when we started Infotagion was that a lot of the disinformation that's being shared is being made to look like it's coming from healthcare professionals, and then people are sharing that because they feel, well, even if they don't know for certain that it's true, it's been sent to them by a friend. It looks like it comes from someone they know, and therefore maybe the precautionary principle should be to share it just in case it's true. And I think the change of behavior we're trying to achieve with Infotagion is to make people think, well, if you're not 100% certain it is true, then check it out before sharing it, because that's the responsible thing to do. Yeah. And I think the challenge for government then is not just to communicate through issuing public information guidance and directing people towards public information and advice, is to actually respond in the channels that people themselves use to communicate with things that checks and rebuts things that may not be true.
Yeah.
But I wonder if I could bring in our sort of regular friends on the show, Charles Creel and John Quinlan. Charles, you keep an active lookout for us around the world on the new breaking issues around disinformation and coronavirus. Has anything caught your eye in the last few days?
Thanks, Damian. There have been a few things that have definitely caught my eye as we go along here. Some writing a little bit close to the bone. One thing we've been doing is breaking down the logarithmic charts of coronavirus cases that everybody is seeing everywhere right now. So these are those charts that show the number of cases in a country against the number of days that have passed since the first 100 cases were diagnosed. They look like a cluster of lines that arc up and to the right, and they start to level off at the top, and it seems that that's where the rate of infection is decreasing in a country. And these are used by readers mostly to compare the performance of different countries' governments, and they feel more accurate because they're comparing the number of days that have passed for each country rather than comparing the performance of each country on a single date. It sounds more scientific, but it isn't. It's a really deceptive chart, and particularly for the layman, and by layman, I mean folks who don't understand logarithms like me. What we have is a huge piece of standardized dissemination here. So there are three really important points that we've dug out of these charts that should be noted about how they misrepresent information. First, the charts only show the number of confirmed cases. So that's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Say Germany and some Scandinavian countries like Norway and Iceland are very aggressive with testing, whereas the UK is testing comparatively few people. So the more people you test, the more cases you find. And a country with massive numbers of cases but very little testing can appear to be outperforming a country with relatively few cases but a program of responsible testing. Second, and critically, the y-axis of these charts is logarithmic, and it's the part that is hardest to understand but most deceptive. So if you look at the vertical axis of them, you'll see that the numbers go from 1,000 cases to 10,000 to 100,000 rather than what you would expect, which is 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. And this means, for example, that the second 100,000 cases take up less vertical than the first 100,000 cases. And so the line that's drawn arcs off to the right, and it seems as though the number of cases are leveling off. It's really reassuring, but it's a complete deceit. Whether it's intentional or not is another issue, but we're fooled by these charts. And then finally, the charts don't account for the population of a country. So 100,000 cases in the US means something completely different than 100,000 cases in Iceland. And this pushes smaller countries where testing programs are more comprehensive still higher on the chart.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you've done a brilliant job in describing very complex charts without charts there, Charles, as well, I think. But do you think in some ways we should talk about sort of concentrations of population in a way, because there are some countries where most of the population live in one quite small place and the rest of the country is quite spread out, and therefore the national statistics could give a slightly distorted picture. I mean, I wonder whether a kind of conurbation to conurbation comparison would be more helpful.
Concentrations of population are important, or the number of deaths compared to that are occurring compared to what would be expected are important. But it's really nearly impossible to do country by country comparisons as long as there isn't consistency in testing.
And indeed, I mean, in the previous Infotagion podcast, we heard about even in a country as geographically small as Singapore, you can still have huge variances in infection rates within that culture as well, with the different areas of that community.
That's absolutely the case. Now, the second thing that we've been looking at this week is the WHO warning on immunity passports. The World Health Organization is responsible for spreading a little misinformation this week. They issued a brief on immunity passports, which theoretically would allow a person who's contracted the virus and now developed immunity a greater level of social and geo access, more mobility. And this could be really useful to countries. For example, those with immunity could do frontline work with less risk than those who haven't contracted COVID. The WHO specifically stated in their release that there was no evidence that those who had contracted the virus would develop immunity against the virus in the future. And in this context, they recommended against immunity passports. Well, this freaked people out and caused quite a lot of anxiety, particularly amongst those who've had the virus and are looking for a bright side. To correct their error in emphasis, on the very same day, the WHO issued a clarification saying, quote, "We expect that most people who are infected with COVID-19 will develop an antibody response that will provide some level of protection." As per usual, very few people saw the clarification. They saw the initial release. But I'll say that I'm ready for my passport.
Very good. So, John, I saw in the last few days that the Ofcom has recognized the Infotagion as one of the leading fact-checking sites that people could go to check out disinformation on coronavirus. And is there anything else that's been happening in Infotagion in the last few days you think we should know about?
Yeah, as always, we get lots of interesting submissions to check. And sometimes they seem a bit ridiculous, some of them. But obviously, as you said before, there is a serious kind of consequence to a lot of the stuff that we're seeing. So, I mean, one thing that really caught our eye this week was a couple of claims on YouTube, taking clips from The Simpsons, Resident Evil films, Netflix, and TV shows, saying that there's an elite that expected this coronavirus to happen, and that actually it's all effectively a plot to get people to accept vaccinations. So, and the pithy one-liner that the video uses was that they are using Tom Hanks to brainwash people. So, it's one of those things where I love.
Is he one of the global lizards?
Well, listen, I wouldn't want to speculate and provide any more fake news, Damon. But it's one of the things where, look, Tom Hanks. I love Tom Hanks, and I think the internet does too. And they've used him there for unfairly. I think that on a serious note, though, some of the other things that we're seeing, there is a bit of a wider theme about it, which is around we're actually seeing slightly less on like the treatment and stuff around cures potentially for COVID-19, and more about the kind of reaction to it, and particularly like government reaction. So we've had a couple around forcible vaccinations in Texas. We've had something on the Danish parliament passing a law that police can enter homes without a warrant, which is not true, but definitely more stuff on civil liberties. So that's been quite an interesting theme this week, and possibly, harkens back to what Martha was saying before about the role that government's got to play. And, we're certainly seeing a lack of trust in government at the moment.
It's interesting because What's your view, John, on the sort of balance of the sorts of disinformation that's out there? Because some people always say, well, is a lot of this just clickbait? But from what you're describing, this is much more political than that.
Yeah, I think never underestimate. There are a lot of people that there's probably a balance between someone being clickbait and doing things for cash, someone doing clickbait to get their own political views out there, and then obviously a slightly different case where there's clickbait and stuff where there's a sort of maybe a state behind it and having their own political issues. I genuinely, on this one, I don't know. It's difficult to know where these have come from, at their exact source. But I think that there's people want to read it as well. There's a lot of people who it does catch their eye. You use Tom Hanks's name, and some people do like a conspiracy theory. So I think that in some respects there's a wider problem here about the kind of trust in society and the way that this is obviously, some of these ideas are not new. Lizards, for example. But every time there's a little bit of a sort of coincidence or wrong use of data, like Charles said before, you can mislead people, and I think that does have a big audience already, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I think that brings us up to about our half an hour mark. Were there any follow-up questions anyone had that we want to cover before we finish?
I mean, I don't know if you saw it, I can't remember if it was this morning or this, I've just been tweeting about it yesterday, that there's 170 scientists published the letter about the contact tracing app.
Yes.
We started there, and I do think it is so deeply and clearly linked to all the stuff we're talking about, because, as everyone knows, it's only 60, if you don't have 60% population usage, then the people have sort of suggested that the app will never really have meaningful usage anyway, and that's clearly never going to happen if there's not the trust, and there's never going to be the trust if the misinformation is too noisy, or the comms is too complicated, or if people don't trust that the app is going to be used for what it's intended to be used for, and there's mission creep or whatever. And I think what's interesting, sorry, I will shut up in a minute, about it, and the letter particularly that was published from these 170, I have to say, mainly male scientists, but that's an aside, is that it calls for a bunch of things from NHSX, which I think are broadly right, but I would add that it really needs this app needs a broad, diverse selection of people to critique it, not just scientists, but also individuals, users, people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds and disciplines, people from the communities that you're talking to now, social scientists, humanities, ethicists. This is really important, and I hope that the government are listening in that to make this work. It really does have to be based on a much wider ranging group of views, I would argue.
I saw a survey on Twitter put up by one of the tech journalists. So as always, you don't know who's responding, but I thought it was a really interesting question that was put, which was, do you think the app should be compulsory, but with high levels of data protection, or voluntary and slightly more open? And people gravitated more towards the first. I don't know if that's because they like the compulsory element or the data protection side of it, or maybe a bit of both if they thought it had to be compulsory to be effective. But I think it's quite interesting, the approach that has been taken in Singapore and Australia with their apps there, where they're saying that the health officials will be warned, or you'll get a warning from them if you've been in contact with someone who's got coronavirus for long enough that you may have been infected by it. But that the data about where you were at the time isn't shared because that's not needed. And I think it will be interesting here as to whether we can create a tool could be created which extracts just enough data to be helpful, but not so much for it to be considered to be a tool of surveillance.
Yes. I mean, I just slightly wry smile when you set up, but whatever the poll set up that as the frame. I don't understand why that has to be the choice.
No.
I'm not totally clear why it always has to be, not compulsory and maybe a bit more shit. That was kind of inherent in the question. Or brilliant, and you have to use it. But it's just we should strive for something more than that. It must be possible to create something that is easy to use. We don't have to force it, but it is just so goddamn clear what's going on. It has a kind of drop dead date when we know that the data will be deleted and this will stop. It is contained to this pandemic that we're in now, that people trust because the terms and conditions are incredibly easy to understand. We work with the commercial sector because clearly government is not going to be able to build stuff at scale and pace with the quality, I would argue, that some of the tech giants can do it with us. that does not seem outside the wit of woman. And I think that we shouldn't be setting up the question in that way. It feels like that is always therefore going to lead to some unnecessary trade-offs.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think a sort of grown-up debate about this suggests we may be able to get to a place which people would buy into. But I think you're right. This can't just be led by a few tech people or a few scientists or a few people at the Department of Health. It's got to be a much wider conversation.
Yes, because we're going to need these things again. This is like the test run for something I believe that's going to continue to happen. So we might as well try and structure it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Great place to end the podcast. Great,
Fantastic.
Brilliant. Okay,
thank you.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins MP, featuring Martha Lane Fox, Charles Creel, and John Quinlan. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.